Ah.
Est-ce que c'est parce que j'utilise le nouveau Teams que les settings, les paramètres ne s'appliquent pas?
Les paramètres.
Je ne sais pas.
OK, bon, on va commencer. Alors, bonjour et bienvenue à notre session du mois d'octobre déjà. Ce soir, on va recevoir Joanne qui va arriver dans probablement une quinzaine de minutes pour nous parler de quoi, Nico, déjà?
De Purview.
De Purview.
En fait, pour la partie gestion documentaire et gouvernance des données dans Office 365, parce que sachant que Purview, c'est un énorme, vous en avez déjà parlé longuement,
ouais.
Et ça changera encore beaucoup. Il va encore y avoir beaucoup d'annonces qui vont être faites bientôt à Ignite. Donc, je pense que Joanne pourra nous en parler un petit peu, je pense. Mais on a beaucoup de choses qui reviennent là-dedans. Ouais.
Excellent. Donc, Purview avec Joanne. On va parler un petit peu des annonces comme d'habitude. On va vous demander, on a un petit 15 minutes, 20 minutes à meubler avant que Joanne arrive, donc on va vous laisser la chance de parler aussi. Fait que, Nicolas, tu veux commencer avec les annonces? Tu as déjà parlé du Ignite. C'est quoi ça, le Ignite?
Oui, j'étais en train...
Ils ne connaissent pas, s'il y en a qui ne connaissent pas.
J'étais en train justement d'essayer de trouver la page, mais j'arrive même pas à la lancer ici, c'est bizarre. Ignite, les dates, c'est quoi déjà?
C'est novembre.
14 au 17 novembre.
Donc, en fait, il y a deux options. Pour ceux qui sont fans de Ignite, il y a une option sur site qui vous permet d'aller à Seattle pour assister directement aux sessions. C'est sûr que vous avez un accès direct aux équipes qui seront présentes, sachant que comme c'est à Seattle, probablement qu'il y a plus d'équipes présentes. Moi, personnellement, je n'ai jamais eu l'expérience d'y aller, donc je ne sais pas trop à quoi ça ressemble pour Ignite. Mais vu la tonne d'annonces qu'il y a de prévues pour cette année, je pense que ça va encore être une très bonne année, Ignite. Moi, je ne peux que vous recommander de suivre Ignite, au moins à distance. Donc, si vous y allez en avance, enfin, si vous y allez physiquement, je crois que ça commence le 14, du 14 jusqu'au 17. Et si vous vous connectez à distance, je crois que ça commence le 16 ou le 15 pour les sessions, il me semble. Donc deux salles, deux ambiances. Ça dépend ce que vous voulez faire. Il y avait aussi des sessions pré-session et comme ils ont l'habitude de faire, qui sont complètes. Cherchez même pas à y aller, c'est déjà complet. C'est déjà archi complet. Il y a même des listes d'attente qui sont déjà pas mal pleines, donc ne cherchez même pas à vous connecter dessus. Beaucoup de nouveautés sur Ignite, c'est quand même plus sur tout ce qui est technique et technologique. Donc, on est moins sur la partie vente, comme on peut avoir sur les autres événements, plutôt pour les partenaires et compagnie, en l'été, à la fin de la fiscale, au début. Mais là, on est vraiment sur l'événement technique. Il y en a toujours un autre au mois de mars, avril, toujours. Mais on est vraiment dans le cycle où, particulièrement par rapport à la Power Platform, vous le savez, on a deux vagues de mise à jour qui sont calées sur novembre pour Wave 2 de l'année calendaire et au mois d'avril pour Wave 1, mais ça ressemble à peu près à ça. Et il y a vraiment beaucoup de grosses annonces. Particulièrement si vous êtes fan de Power BI, il y a un énorme projet qui est lancé, vous le savez déjà pour ceux qui suivent Power BI, c'est le rentrée. Ça, c'est vraiment un gros projet, un gros morceau, pour être capable de lancer, en fait, d'intégrer Power BI directement aux solutions Power Platform. La technologie maintenant qui a été retenue pour le packaging, c'est les solutions. Tout ce qui est Power Platform, on pourra en parler plus tard. Tout ce qui est Viva, il y a beaucoup d'annonces également sur tout ce qui est Viva. Engage qui revient fort, moi, je trouve.
On en parle de plus en plus. Il y a une annonce.
Alors,
il y a une annonce qui était faite aussi OneDrive,
yes.
un nouveau OneDrive qui était annoncé.
Mais ça, il y a un nouveau OneDrive tous les ans.
Ouais, il y a un nouveau OneDrive à tous les ans. Oui, Engage, alias, c'était quoi déjà le nom? Il y a quoi? Yammer, donc le nouveau Engage, ils ont fait des belles choses quand même, je l'avoue, là, mais je ne vois pas encore beaucoup de clients qui l'utilisent. Juste à titre d'information, est-ce qu'il y en a ici qui utilisent Engage dans leur entreprise juste pour le fun? Benoît,
Non.
oui.
Oui. En fait,
on est déjà commencé.
Par rapport à Engage, ce qui est super intéressant, c'est de voir le repositionnement finalement des communautés. Engage, le hub des groupes Engage était annoncé un peu comme les nouvelles communautés externes.
Ouais.
Il y avait comme une espèce de compétition entre le Teams invité, qui était comme un peu mal compris par rapport à ce qu'on aurait pu éventuellement faire. Donc, c'est définitivement Engage qui est la solution pour les communautés externes avec la notion de External Network de Yammer, qui existe depuis très longtemps.
Très fier de moi, j'ai fait la promotion de Viva Engage avec un client.
Tu y arrives. Tu y arrives. Est-ce que tu t'es fait mal?
Non, ça n'a pas fait mal. Le client, je ne sais pas, par exemple, s'il s'est fait mal, mais on verra un peu.
Il a pleuré toute la nuit après ça. Après, il a bu.
Benoît, je ne sais pas, ce serait peut-être le fun, peut-être un jour de venir parler de ce que vous en faites avec Viva Engage. S'il y a des choses qui ne sont pas trop confidentielles, puis c'est un projet intéressant, ou s'il y a quelqu'un d'autre là, dans l'audience qui fait du Engage, ben, peut-être aller parler, parce que les gens ont de la difficulté. On peut en parler, nous, mais j'ai encore beaucoup de... Quand on parle d'Engage, je dis, ouais, mais on peut faire des équipes dans Team, on peut avoir un genre de communauté dans Team. Pourquoi on a Engage? Ben, ce serait le fun de peut-être sortir quelque chose là-dessus. Début décembre, normalement, après le Ignite, on fait un retour sur le Ignite. Fait que notre session de décembre, on a déjà, hey, c'est la première fois, je pense, depuis quelques années. On a 2 sessions en attente qui sont prévues déjà avec des conférenciers externes qui vont venir parler. Puis on n'a même pas eu besoin de les chercher, c'est eux qui nous ont cherchés. Il y en a peut-être un qu'on va repousser en début d'année parce qu'on aime bien ça, faire après le Ignite, un retour sur le Ignite parce qu'il y a toujours plein d'annonces qui sont faites. Donc, je pense bien qu'on va faire ça.
J'ai une question comme ça par rapport à Ignite.
Ouais.
Est-ce que plutôt que de le faire le soir, est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas essayer de faire une session l'après-midi parce que ce serait comme plus long, les retours Ignite. Faire une session plus longue, c'est de 3 heures. Est-ce que ça vous intéresserait? Faire une session plus longue de 3 heures?
Ouais. Autre? Oui, non. Des pouces en l'air, des petits cœurs.
Des cœurs, moi j'adore les cœurs.
On voit pas beaucoup de petits cœurs et beaucoup de pouces en l'air. Il y en a un, Benoît.
Eh ben, on aura l'occasion de vous le reproposer, mais je me dis à chaque fois, parler
toujours de temps pour
d'Ignite en 2 heures, c'est quand même court, à
Mm-hmm.
mon avis. Déjà qu'on a du mal quelquefois à parler juste des nouveautés dans des 2 heures. Je me dis, on pourrait, comme on a les speakers, autant garder les speakers et faire un événement supplémentaire pour Ignite.
On va regarder.
Juste après Ignite, moi je ne serai pas là. Je serai en République dominicaine, donc vous faites ce que vous voulez.
OK. Autre chose, Nico, dans les annonces, à part les Ignite.
Sur les événements, il y a eu Ottawa le week-end dernier, le vendredi dernier, qui était le fun, a priori. Vincent, toi, tu y étais. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas pu y être, parce que c'était un vendredi. Dans les annonces, il y a un événement qui s'en vient au mois de février à Québec. Donc, je suis en train de finaliser la page pour l'annoncer. Ce sera un M365. Et donc, ça s'en vient à Québec. Comme on n'y va pas très souvent, ce serait bien qu'on fasse quelque chose là-bas. Février, parce que c'est les carnavals là-bas, et puis c'est le fun d'y aller pour le moment du carnaval. Donc, ça peut être sympa. Et puis avril, quelque chose ici à Montréal. Enfin, pas avril, pardon, juin, excusez-moi, pour la Formule 1. Ici, pour Montréal, et ce serait février, le carnaval pour Québec.
Est-ce qu'il va y avoir un Collab Days l'année prochaine?
Sensiblement le même principe. Le même principe, mais ça va être une conférence qui n'aura pas le nom Collab Days, probablement.
Peut-être.
Peut-être. On n'a rien encore de décidé.
Sincèrement, ça s'appellera Microsoft 365 Days.
Mm-hmm.
Et, moi, les noms Collab, AMS, machin bidule, j'en ai un peu rien à foutre. Le but, c'est juste d'avoir une journée où on peut se marrer et puis on a des speakers. Participer à une chapelle, personnellement, parce qu'on se rend compte, pour ceux qui suivent un petit peu les histoires dans la communauté, on se rend compte qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui se tirent la bourre entre eux pour mettre en place leur marque, machin bidule. Et, je ne suis pas un grand fan de ce truc-là, personnellement. Donc, je sais que Serge, pas trop non plus. Je pense qu'on se rejoint un peu là-dessus, quoi.
Okay, excellent. Donc, à mettre au calendrier, vous allez avoir plus d'informations. Février à Québec, juin à Montréal. Puis peut-être quelque chose, moi, j'aimerais peut-être faire une autre rencontre. Là, on en a déjà parlé, là, peut-être en février ou quelque chose comme ça, à Montréal aussi. Si on est capable d'aligner peut-être quelque chose de plus petit, dépendamment des conférenciers qui vont venir, peut-être des Européens qui vont venir de Québec, aligner quelque chose à Montréal tout de suite après pour avoir les mêmes conférenciers, pour faire la suite. C'était ça les plans. Comme vous voyez, c'est encore embryonnaire, mis à part, là, Nicolas a avancé beaucoup pour Québec. Pour Cancun. Cancun, c'est au mois de mai. Mais Cancun, ça va être très limité, donc une trentaine de personnes.
C'est ça, 30 personnes. Uniquement sur la gouvernance de la Power Platform.
Excellent.
Concernant la gouvernance de la Power Platform, je me pose encore la question, savoir si je l'intègre comme une sous-liste à l'intérieur du GUM 365, en mettant la gouvernance Power Platform, ou alors de partir à un autre truc à côté qui serait peut-être un peu chiant parce que ça serait un autre truc différent. Ouais, mais Power Platform, j'ai fait des propositions de session, Luc n'a pas le temps de répondre, il a son truc à lui, puis c'est correct. Moi, j'ai envie de parler de la gouvernance de la Power Platform. Je trouve qu'il manque quelque chose là-dessus. Quand je vois mes clients et quand je vois les gens que je vois en formation, à chaque fois, les questions sont les mêmes sur la gouvernance et de la technologie, la gouvernance de la plateforme et la gouvernance des projets.
En fait, je pense qu'on pourrait faire quelque chose sur la gouvernance Microsoft 365 en vrai.
Ça pourrait être une idée.
Gouvernance Teams, c'était le titre de ma session, en fait, que j'ai fait à Montpellier. En passant, pour ceux qui ne sont pas au courant, j'arrive de la France. J'étais en France pour la Coupe du monde de rugby les 10 derniers jours. Et j'en ai profité pour faire une petite escale à Montpellier, aller parler à une conférence. Puis le titre de ma session, c'était Microsoft 300. J'ai mis des mots anglais parce que les Français aiment bien les mots anglais. Fait que Microsoft 365, c'est du self-service. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on aurait besoin de gouvernance? Donc, puis j'ai expliqué plein de concepts sur la gouvernance, puis pourquoi on pourrait avoir besoin de la gouvernance, c'est quoi les différentes visions, ben, plein de monde, plein de questions, puis un besoin d'expliquer ça, fait que ça serait peut-être intéressant, ou de préparer pendant notre groupe. Ça, c'est une chose qu'on pourrait discuter, peut-être même vous sonder, là, parce que vous êtes les membres du groupe, voir ce qui vous intéresse. Peut-être faire un 3 mois ou mois 1, on parle de gouvernance Microsoft 365, Microsoft Power Platform, les différents types de gouvernance. S'il y a assez de monde d'intéressés, ben, pourquoi pas faire un autre groupe, faire une autre rencontre qui va parler. Allô, Joanne! Donc, pourquoi pas faire une autre rencontre mensuelle, 2 rencontres dans le mois. Ça sera de voir le niveau d'intérêt qui va être.
On aura l'occasion de vous en reparler. Mais comme Joanne vient de nous rejoindre, je pense qu'on va utiliser son temps le mieux possible. Oui, Joanne, how are you doing? Tu parles français un peu, hein?
Non, ouais.
Si, mais
You can turn on your mic so we can hear your beautiful French.
I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh. Hi, everybody. Bonjour. Oh, now I can't. Oh, okay. Now you're muted, Serge.
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah,
Oh.
So he's gonna show muted in his profile, but
Okay.
the room will carry the sound. So
Yeah. So
Okay.
introduction in French, and then we'll let you go. Fait que, donc,
Okay.
au tout début, elle va nous parler de gouvernance, de Purview, en fait, la gestion des documents. La session est en anglais. Donc,
t'as pas licence premium pour faire la transcription en temps réel pour avoir les sous-titres français?
j'ai même pas vérifié si on avait la version premium sur notre tenant.
Si tu me permets, juste une seconde. Donc, Joanne, juste pour introduire Joanne, Joanne est la fondatrice d'une compagnie qui s'appelle Next Novus, qui est une compagnie de conseil Microsoft 365. Donc, elle n'est pas uniquement limitée à Purview non plus, mais elle fait pas mal de choses. De nombreuses fois MVP, 6 fois, après ce qui me semble. Joanne me dira si jamais je me trompe. Sur MVP service M365 et applications. Donc, elle passe vraiment beaucoup de temps à conseiller ses clients sur tout ce qui est gouvernance, architecture d'information et sur Syntex. Syntex, a priori, qu'elle aime beaucoup. Donc, si jamais vous avez des questions concernant ces sujets-là, n'hésitez surtout pas, en marge de sa session, elle se fera un plaisir d'essayer de vous répondre, je pense. Elle a un blog qui est très, très bien documenté. Donc, je ne peux que vous recommander de prendre le lien qui se trouve dans le Meetup pour suivre Joanne sur son blog ou sur son LinkedIn. Vraiment, elle publie beaucoup, beaucoup de contenu. Elle est super active, tant dans les conférences qu'en ligne. Donc, n'hésitez surtout pas à la suivre.
Et j'ai vu, on a l'option de traduction du transcript. Fait qu'on va essayer de prendre la langue en anglais et générer le transcript en français. On va voir. Joanne, floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think it was a great introduction. I caught some of those words. Thank you. Do you want me to turn on transcripts on my PowerPoint? I heard you talking about that a little bit.
If you want, yeah, it might be interesting too to show the technology to everyone.
Yeah, I don't know how good it is, but let's try it.
Yeah.
Spoken language is English. I want it to go above slide. So how do I pick the language?
I don't even know.
Oh, subtitle. Here we go. Sorry. Let's try it.
Okay.
But I do have the transcription turned on, and it's translating too. So we can compare after the session and see which translation works.
Okay.
Qui comprennent pas bien l'anglais, vous pouvez faire afficher la transcription, puis la transcription va s'afficher maintenant en français. Ça va traduire ce que Joanne va nous dire. So go ahead, Joanne, all yours.
All right, thank you. I just want to do a sound check. You can hear me okay before I go too far? Okay, I can't see the print transcription at all, but let's just proceed. Okay, so come on. All right, this was a fun presentation for me to put together because I talk to a lot of customers that implement Microsoft, certain features inside Microsoft Purview, and I get some pretty consistent questions from them. So I'm going to share today what I hear from customers, what they're asking me, and versus what I really think that my value is and what I think that they should be focusing on instead. I've just because of time, I focused in this discussion on some specific features inside Microsoft Purview, that being Purview information protection, data loss prevention, and data lifecycle and records management. So each of those topics in and of themselves are very big, and I could probably talk for an hour on enablement strategy on each of them. So I've boiled it down to kind of a few nuggets on each one, and hopefully that you find value in that. And this is all built from my lessons from working with customers day in, day out, the struggles we see. So hopefully you find some value in that. These are common asks I get from my customers, always looking for best practices, quick wins, a recipe. I heard that third one this week. What is the 20% of the effort to get us 80% there? So everybody wants this to be simple, like boil this down to what's the thing I should be focusing on. At the same time, I hear these things from the customers, which are a bit in conflict with their desire of making this simple, wanting everything to be automated and not getting in the user's way. Many come to me with an overly optimistic timeline. They sometimes don't have the right people at the table, and sometimes they don't have executive support. So these two things with each other make this sometimes a very challenging problem to solve with the customer. So my question is always, and I think about this a lot, is are there best practices and quick wins when it comes to implementing Microsoft Purview? Now, I've heard you've already looked at some of the features inside Microsoft Purview and what's in there. So this session isn't about that. I will talk about it at a high level, but this is more an enablement strategy conversation. So I believe instead what the conversation should be surrounded or be focused on with my customers is making sure the right stakeholders are there from the start, building what I like to call a day 1, day 2, day 3 enablement strategy built on real planning and discovery in your own environment, in their own environment, and an understanding of what needs to be done before touching the keyboard. If I have a bunch of IT pros coming to me on how to implement records management, and it has happened, that is just a disaster waiting to happen, because there's so many things that could go sideways if you jump in, create a bunch of things inside Microsoft Purview without knowing the follow-on effects. So first one I'm going to talk about is Purview information protection. So the specific area inside Microsoft Purview is under information protection. So we're talking about sensitivity labels and label policies, and then some of the automation capabilities. So here's just a sample of some labels in a demo tenant. There's a bunch of labels. Some of them are for files and emails. Some of them are for sites and groups. Decisions you need to make on information protection all up is you need to understand this is a very nuanced subject. There's no black and white, maybe on a few things there are, but there's a scale of protection that you have to figure out where your organization should be on. At one extreme is everything is locked down, no external sharing, no guests allowed, that kind of thing. The other one is wide open. So there's, of course, many gradients in between, which is likely where your organization is going to land. So there's an understanding of data risks that are on that gradient, which ones you can accept, which ones you can't accept, and then you can decide on the right controls to implement to mitigate the risks that are there. So a bunch of controls you can implement inside Microsoft Purview. Sensitivity labels is one of them for applying certain kinds of protection, i.e. encryption controls and different different controls on what you can and cannot do with the file when a sensitivity label is on it, or when you work in a team when a sensitivity label has been assigned to it. So understanding where you are in this scale is uber important when you're working on a project like this. Microsoft has a framework that I always work from when I'm implementing information protection. It's an established framework. I'm not reinventing the wheel. So it does give customers some comfort and confidence that they're following a well-worn path when it comes to this. Starting with data identification and discovery, then moving on to labeling your content, bringing in encryption where it makes sense. So one important thing I want to point out about this is step 1, data identification and discovery. The time you spend on this, and it can be significant, especially in large tenants, you can use in many other features other than just sensitivity labels. Now, I'm going to be talking about data loss prevention today. So time you spend on that is beneficial for you when you're setting up your DLP policies, but it also helps your insider risk management, communication compliance, privacy management. It helps all of those things. So spending a good amount of time on data identification is time well spent, I guess, is what I want to, capture in this picture. So I'm going to go through each of these for implementing information protection. On data identification, there's some very tangible decisions you can make. I've worked with big customers that have this fairly well documented in their enablement strategy and implementation plan. 4 steps. So number 1 is decide where you're looking. Information protection can look at of course, all of the Microsoft 365 apps, and you can see them all there, but it can look in on-prem locations, so file shares. It can look on non-Microsoft 365 apps. So focusing in on where are we going to start is super helpful, because if you just are looking everywhere, it can quickly become overwhelming on what you're focusing on and, kind of where to start. So I always like to say, define and decide what is in scope. And I have reasons on the bottom on why I go this way. It really helps to focus your efforts. What file types are you looking in? That is also important because it will determine if you need to use a special client for setting the sensitivity label, the unified labeling client. Microsoft is working at building most of that capability into the built-in apps, but it's not quite there. And in addition, if you want to label things that are on non-Office, like a PDF file, you have to have some other, potentially some other clients installed. So these decisions really matter when it comes to deploying this at scale across an enterprise. What sensitive data are you looking for? Now, this is a big one, and you're going to spend a lot of time here. So the data classification feature inside Microsoft Purview gives you insights on what's going on across your tenant. So I will show what this looks like. So I have a demo tenant here. By default, Microsoft deploys a whole bunch of built-in sensitive information types and trainable classifiers. You don't have to do anything. They're just there. And they scan your environment in read-only. And by doing that, they can tell what kind of content is in your environment. So this is the demo tenant. If I go to classifiers, it's going to show me all of the built-in classifiers Microsoft has. Here's the trainable classifiers. You can see a bunch of them that they've built. You can, of course, build custom ones if you want. And then sensitive information types are here. And this spans industry. You can build custom if you want. If we search on Canada in here, you can see all of the Canadian sensitive information types they've provided. Now, what's telling about this scanning that they do will show itself inside Content Explorer. And you can see in this tenant all of the matches it's found on the sensitive information types and the M365 apps that it's found them in. And you can drill down, won't do that right now, but right to the file level if you want inside any of these. I'm going to skip over sensitivity labels and retention labels. Here are the matches on trainable classifiers. Now, many of these are business trainable classifiers, English only. Okay, so if you wanted to do it French, you're going to have to build a custom trainable classifier, but you can certainly do that. The only one they have French in and other languages are the ones that are used in communication compliance. I think profanity, threat, and harassment they've got in multilingual, but these business ones they've just done in English. So an FYI for you there. So looking at this, can just give you a bird's eye view of what's going on across our tenant. Basically, you start to realize, oh my goodness, there's people storing credit card numbers in their OneDrive accounts, for instance, or sending them on their email. You're going to start to see that in here. So it's a bit of an art and a science, I would say, it's typically IT teams that go in there and try to assess the accuracy of what's going on there. Microsoft they don't hit it 100% of the time. So you have to, let's say, some of the sets are pretty good at. So we'll pick a credit card number. Pretty confident that a credit card number is going to be a good match, unless you happen to get some false positives with other numbers that you may have in your organization. So that assessment has to go on in there in this step 3, and you really have to decide what is it we're looking at, because there's over 300 sits. You can't look at them all. So deciding what is kind of the most critical that we see in data classification that we want to look at. And that's where number 4 comes in, that assessment work. So the goal of this is to determine which of the classifiers are required in your environment. Because ultimately you want to classify your documents, maybe put a confidential sensitivity label or highly confidential label on there, and potentially encrypt it, which ones you need to customize and which ones you have to build from scratch. So if you needed a French financial trainable classifier, you'd 100% have to build that one from scratch. So for each one of these, it's important to understand, probably from an IT perspective, what the difference is, because there's significant difference in a few areas. One is how it identifies the content, examples of it, and then where it can be used. So remember earlier I said the work the time you spend on discovery can be used in other tools. So what I'm showing on the bottom is all of the places that this particular classifier, so a sensitive information type or SIT, can be used. So it uses keywords, pattern matching, regular expressions, keyword lists, keyword dictionaries, those kinds of things, keyword proximity to the regular expression, to kind of do a confidence level on how confident the classifier is that it's found a match. I worked with a very large organization, and they went through this process of assessing the accuracy with sample representative files, because you're going to have to get very specific on what is a false positive, what is a true positive, what is a false negative. Like, you have to get into that level of detail before you can be confident in the classifier to recommend or automatically apply a sensitivity label, because that's ultimately, on information protection, what you use these classifiers for. You want to be confident that, oh, somebody's working in a document and there's a MasterCard number, let's say, in there, I'm going to automatically apply a confidential sensitivity label. You have to be pretty confident you have that right before you do that kind of thing. So going through this process is necessary. Many ways you can, and many techniques you can use for this, and I have them documented on the bottom. One can do it one file at a time, some can do it bulk files. So won't go into that detail, but I just want to stress that this assessment phase can take quite a bit of time, and it's super important. Next is trainable classifier. I talked about these before. They are the business ones, which is typically what you're interested in for applying a sensitivity label, that their business would be agreements, financial documents, budgets, contracts, statements of work, etc. HR documents, English only. But you can see all of the places you can use a trainable classifier, in a ton of places inside Purview as a condition. This is how you build your own. Totally possible to build your own. It just takes some time, and it takes a lot of sample documents to build your own. So you wouldn't want to do this for all of your content, but there may be use cases where it would, pay back for you to build a custom trainable classifier. Exact data match is something that can scale to millions of items of values. So let's say you have a customer database, and whenever that specific customer number is in a document or sent in an email, so very specific to your organization, you can use it as a classifier and take certain actions. So it might be a bunch of customer numbers in a database, or patient numbers, or employee numbers, let's say. So you can use that as well. Quite a bit of setup required to do one of these sits, but totally possible. And document fingerprint, I have not used this, but and I actually thought Microsoft was going to get rid of this, but they've recently expanded it, so I don't think they will. And you can use it for forms. If you send a lot of forms around your organization, they have a fingerprint, if you will, and Microsoft you can upload the form and kind of train the classifier to recognize the form, and then use it as a condition for a data loss prevention policy. But it is considered a document fingerprint sit. Okay, so we've done some discovery. We've maybe highlighted 10 or 15 sensitive information types or trainable classifiers we want to hone in on. And now we want to classify our content. So one of the biggest outcomes of classification is deciding what the sensitivity label taxonomy is. Many organizations already have some kind of a documented information confidentiality classification standard, like policy written. And sometimes the taxonomy is already in there. And then normally your labels kind of follow along that same terminology. If not, you can come up with your own names. So here's just two examples on the bottom. One's a parent label only structure. The other one has parent and sublabels. Both work, both have pros and cons, but you have to define a taxonomy. End users see these sensitivity labels in many places. They see them in their office apps when they're working and they're in a document. They will see sensitivity on the toolbar, and all of the published sensitivity labels will show there. They can be applied to all kinds of file types, manually applied, defaulted, recommended based on content that's in there, based on the classifier that it's looking for, or automatically applied. You can also apply it through code. And optionally, you don't have to, but you can apply additional controls in the form of encryption, meaning who can access it and what they can do with it once that label is on there. Maybe they can do everything but print it or download it, let's say. And visual markings, which are really important. A visual marking is a protection control. It's in the face of an end user. They can see a watermark or a header that this is, internal use only, or for your eyes only, or something like that. So pretty important to use that on some of these labels. You can also apply sensitivity labels at the container level. And by that, I mean a site, a team, a group, and it applies different types of controls. It can control if external sharing is allowed in that container, if guests are allowed in that container. It has integration with conditional access and enter ID. So you can have MFA is required for your guests when they come in, if they hit a site with a certain sensitivity label, or maybe unmanaged devices. If they hit that site, they can't download any content from there. So some of those controls are available through a sensitivity label at the container level. What it does not do is automatically label everything on that container to have that sensitivity label. There are two different types of controls working there. Okay, so just want to point out taxonomies. You can have different taxonomies for file and email than from containers. They can be the same or they can be different. It's completely up to you to decide how you want to do this. Remember, there are implementing different controls. And my recommendation is to keep them separate just from an administration perspective. It's easier, but you do have to be quite careful in the names that you pick, and because you don't want to confuse end users. They're going to see the file and email label right in the Office app when they're working with the document. So they're going to see it. Let's say they're going to see confidential in their document. If they're on a confidential site, they're going to see the sensitivity label that's been put on that site visually as well. I like the idea of keeping the same names, but putting some word after it, like I've done here, confidential area, to indicate it's still confidential. I'm following generally the same taxonomy naming structure, but it's different, okay? But it's up to you to decide how you want this to play back and forth. There are some rules I have come up with, guidelines. They're not, hard and fast, of course, but it's just from me working with some customers and seeing some problems, and then just trying to boil them down to some things, and some things to consider. One is, do not expose users to more labels than are necessary. When you get into your file and email sensitivity labels, it can be very tempting to do a whole bunch of sub-labels for every single different use case scenario you may have for, all these external sharing scenarios you may have. Just be very careful with that. Both from an end user perspective, it can be confusing for them to know which label to pick, and from an administration perspective to just administer and manage these things as well. If you possibly can, the second rule there is share your taxonomy across the firm. You don't have to, so you can have a different taxonomy based on geo-region, or maybe executives get an additional label, or the finance team gets an extra label, or the legal team. I see that one a lot. That's fine, you can do that, but just try to keep everybody by and large using the same taxonomy, and try to minimize those exceptions as much as you can. I talked about the parent label versus parent and sub label. A big thing to consider on this is two things. One is when you downgrade, if you just have a parent label taxonomy and you downgrade, there's a priority on labels, lowest to highest. If you downgrade one parent level lower, an end user will be prompted to justify why they're doing that, which is a good control to have in place. If you have sub-labels and you just downgrade from one sub-label to a lesser sub-label within a parent label, you will not be prompted for that. That may be a consideration. But there also is a problem if you start with parent labels only and then you decide to use sub-labels after. You potentially are going to have a bunch of labeled content out there with the parent label that now has sub-labels. So it can get a little bit messy on a go-forward basis, trying to go back and fix some of those things, because it won't automatically fix for you. Make sure your label names are super clear. So in English, confidential, highly confidential. It's obvious by that name which one is more confidential, but may not be if you have restricted and top secret. I mean, people might not know what the more sensitive of those two are. So keep the names as simple as you possibly can. Using the traffic light protocol for colors, great. It's visual. People understand it immediately. That's a good tip. Header, footer, and watermark, great idea. But if you have corporate templates that already have those things built into them, you can get some clashing there. This is more than an IT decision. You need to have corp communications involved on this. This is big end user impacting, needs to work for them for sure. So there's an example on the bottom. I always say it's great to start with manually labeling. Make sure all the labels are published to users. Set a default if you can align on what that is. I think it's a good idea too. start with recommending, and only when you're really confident that you've got those recommends right, then go to auto apply. So this is going to happen over a period of time. I call it day 1, day 2, day 3. I'm not literal in that sense. You know, that could be weeks, that could be months. It's whatever cadence that you're comfortable implementing these things. Microsoft put out a great way to talk about how to make sure everything in your environment has a sensitivity label. And so I kind of summarized it and put it in a graphic. We're talking active files, files that people are working on, files that are in transit, so emails that are being sent, and then files that are at rest. So if you've migrated a bunch of content into, let's say, OneDrive, or even SharePoint, and much of it isn't being actively worked on, it could still hold sensitive content. So you want to make sure it has the appropriate sensitivity label on it. So you have to use different Purview features in order to get a sensitivity label on there, which is what I've tried to capture in the bottom part of this. I'm going to focus on files at rest. A great example for this is there's a service side auto labeling policy. So that basically means it's running in the background. It's not client side where end users are working. It can look, find sensitive information in a document and automatically apply a sensitivity label. Yeah, so take away from this, one Purview feature can't do it all. This is why it's a strategy, it's a roadmap, it's a can be a fairly lengthy timeline, and you can incrementally add on this in your timeline. Don't try to boil the ocean, certainly, and trust but verify. So always start with recommend on the sensitivity labels and don't go to automatically apply right away, because unless you're 100% confident, you might be mislabeling things. And that could be frustrating for an end user. When you're publishing, there's certain places that are groups that you are allowed to use when you're publishing, and then some that are not supported. Roadmap feature that's coming out, which will be fairly useful, is you will be able to add a security group or an M365 group as a member of property to a dynamic group, which will be very helpful just to keep down on the maintenance of the groups that are included in these policies. So yeah, here's an example. Policies are additive. So in this example, executives, they have what's in perhaps the global policy, plus maybe some additional labels. Typically, I see the IT teams that are administering this have all the labels published to them just so they can test it out. So, you know, a bit of a layout needs to happen on how you want your policies to be deployed, the priority of them. There again, priority matters here as well, and what the settings are in each one. It's at the policy level that you define a default label, if it's required or not, if end users have to enter a justification if they downgrade. So a ton of decisions have to go into each of these policies. Okay, DLP, or data loss prevention, I want to talk about next. So back in Purview, this is this section where this particular area, I have some policies already created in here. Now, DLP is not a replacement for sensitivity labels. It does a different thing. It's complementary to sensitivity labels. Your data governance strategy all up should likely include both information protection with sensitivity labels and data loss prevention. So example of DLP scenarios is stopping a team's chat from being post-send from being sent to an external guest if it has sensitive information on it. It won't stop the chat from being sent, but it's within seconds it will block it. Stop sensitive data from being printed, or you could block an email. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. even down to the endpoint. You can see there, you can stop something from being copied to a USB drive or even being put on your clipboard. There's a little toast notification that will come up if you attempt to do that. So the power of the Purview DLP solution is there's no agent on the endpoint device for endpoint DLP, and it's a unified solution across all of these different apps and services. So,
Joanne, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We got a question in the chat.
Yep. I can't see.
Phil.
Okay.
Phil, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly? No answer? Okay, so let me, okay, you can't, okay. So Phil asked, can we combine multiple sensitivity labels? For example, set 1, external, internal, confidential, set 2, finance, IT, managers, HR, and get the result with confidential finance, confidential IT, confidential manager, and etc.
I don't quite understand the question. Sorry, can you repeat it again?
So Phil is asking, can we combine multiple sensitivity labels?
Combine them.
Yeah.
One sensitivity label goes for one document. You can't have multiple sensitivity labels per document. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but you can have, a taxonomy of labels is published to a user. So they will see, if you have 5 labels published to them, they will see all 5. They can pick any of the 5 to apply to their content. Not sure if that's answering your question.
We'll see if Phil, yeah, it answered.
Yeah, okay,
Yes,
great.
it's another question about bilingual.
About?
Bilingual.
Oh, okay.
You want to get a bilingual label, even a way to do it, even using PowerShell?
There is a way to do it, but it involves some PowerShell. But yeah, you can do as many languages as you want. There's a primary language, and then for every other language you want to do, it's just putting in the additional language. So you would put in not only the sensitivity label name and the other alternate language, but also the description. When an end user hovers over a sensitivity label, I'm actually going to show you this. I'm in PowerPoint here. I have sensitivity labels published to me. I'm going to see this sensitivity drop down. Here's all the labels published to me. When I hover over it, I get a description. So you can do that multilingual as well. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, did it again. All right. Okay, so Purview DLP covers all of these things, even on-prem. So I am in DLP, and what they've done is, remember, they're scanning your environment. So in the top left corner, when you go into DLP, even if you haven't set up a single DLP policy, you're going to see this area, and it's in this particular demo, it's saying, I've detected all of these documents across your environment with this type of sensitive information. I can set up a policy for you if you want me to do that. So if I click Get Started, it's already saying, if you click Create Selected Policies, it's automatically going to create all of those DLP policies for you. You can, of course, go in and change them, but so I'm going to deselect all of them and just pick the IP and trade secrets policy. This is a quick way to get a policy set up if you want. Unfortunately, what it does is you'll notice the status is on. I would love if they just turned it to test or something like that, but no, they turned it on. So my recommendation is you can do this, but go into here after, edit it, and make sure it's got the right settings that you want. So if I pick the top one, and you can see by me selecting that, it's created 2 DLP policies, one for M365 apps, another one for at the endpoint. So basically, it's going to be looking for any IP and trade secrets when I'm doing activity on the endpoint. So you can see that's all the locations it picked for M365. So Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. And this is a condition. So it's looking for a set of trainable classifiers in this case, and that's what it considers IP and trade secrets, is all of those trainable classifiers. It's going to notify users with email and policy tips, restrict access for external users, and send alerts to administrators. So you can, of course, and you should edit this and change it to suit your organization. Maybe you want to update the policy tip to make it a little bit more organization specific, for instance. And then here, I probably would test it out first. I wouldn't leave it as turn it on right away. So just make sure you realize that that's what it does once you turn that on. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt again.
Yeah.
I know that there is already a feature that will let you log all the changes on the files and elements and etc. But if there are a complete log about all the changes you try to apply on any administrative features, I mean, like if you are changing the DLP strategy, what the logs looks like. Is there any global logs that will keep the trace of all the different changes that have been applied on any document or any information? Because we need to keep this information somewhere. If you make any change, especially if you are globally applying a different change or different strategy on, I don't know, thousands of documents, we need to keep this information somewhere. So is there any log or how it works? Yeah, the audit log, I know we got the audit log, but
Right.
Does it work at the administrative level also?
I mean, it does log some administrative activities. I don't know if it's a complete and an exhaustive list for sure. Yes, that's the point. It's a good point. I don't know what that list is, but it would be in the unified audit log for sure. It would be, but I just don't know if it would be an exhaustive list. I would be interested in that, but
because it's huge. I mean, if you are changing the policies
yes,
on thousands of documents.
Wow. It is. Yes, it's massive, and
we need to get the name of this guy.
Yeah, it's basically saying, so what we're talking about here, I'm just going to go into, we don't have it in here.
I need to get this name.
Well, I'm going to go into Activities Explorer, sorry, in DLP. I'm going to go into Activity Explorer within DLP. What this basically is a snapshot of the audit log from, it's got more than DLP stuff in here, but this is showing all of the activity that's gone on, end user activity. But I think there should also be administrative level activity. I don't know if it'll show in here. Not right there. It doesn't. So good question. Don't know.
Yeah, because with the Lao 25 and all this new stuff, we need it. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who's watching the administrators? That's a big concern for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe a premium feature.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably in here. Actually, if we look at, let's just do this.
No, it's a joke. It's a joke, Joanne. Don't worry. We are talking somewhere else.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
You're welcome. Okay. Okay, gotta click through this. Okay. So an enablement timeline, again, start with that discovery mode. Go to monitor mode is always my go-to. You want to see what end users are doing. The length of time depends. 30 days, 10 days, whatever is appropriate for your organization to give you a good feel for what's going on. There's in-app policy tips, which I love about DLP. So right when you're working within a document, if you put in something sensitive, you're going to see a yellow bar up at the top saying, I've detected sensitive information in this email or this Word document. Don't share this outside of the org or something like that. So really important to come up with good wording inside of your policy tips. Funny enough, I worked with the organization that intentionally changed their policy tips to put the word Microsoft has detected that you have sensitive information in this email. And they did that instead of saying, we have detected that there has been sensitive information, because end users seem to find more comfort in the fact that Microsoft, this is kind of a global thing and it's part of Word or whatever. And we've noticed that there's something in here, rather than IT being the overlords and, seeing inside everybody's documents. So your mileage may vary on that, but it's something that I've run across with customers. You can apply protection. So there's an office message encryption, inside exchange. You could automatically apply encryption based on sensitive information that's in a document. And optionally, you can block. You can actually prevent somebody from getting an email sent to an external recipient or from sharing a document. So my comment on the bottom, this is, an oversimplification and a summarization of the process. It does not cover every edge case for sure, but it gets most of the way there for most of the things you're going to want to do with DLP. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about encryption. It's really important you identify at the beginning of your information protection project what your key risky use case scenarios are for dealing with sensitive information. Your legal team is a great example of this. They're dealing with sensitive information. It's common for them to have to share that and collaborate with external legal teams. That's a good example. So identify what all those use cases are, because this is where the idea of your encrypted labels and how you want to fit them into your taxonomy and all of your test cases, they're all going to be built off these use case scenarios. You want to make sure you're covering off all of these scenarios and get them involved in your system testing as well, in your pilot group rather. So you don't have to have your encrypted labels decided from the beginning, but if you can, it's good, because there are implications of you trying to add it after the fact. I'll give you a good example. If you have a label and it doesn't initially have encryption, and you decide 6 months and it's being applied to content across your environment, and you decide 6 months down the road, man, we should have some encryption built into that label. You can certainly change the label and add the encryption after the fact from Microsoft Purview, but all of those tens of thousands of documents that may be sitting out there that have the label applied will not automatically inherit that new encryption setting. So you're going to be in a position where you've got some documents out there with that label that aren't encrypted. So it puts you in a bit of a bind. So just know that going in to be able to define your taxonomy correctly from the get-go. You can always add over time. I've seen companies go both ways on this. Protection and encryption, there is side effects to it with end user impact. So there's a training piece that has to come along with this for your internal people that work with sensitive content, but also communicate to your external parties that are accepting this, or that are receiving this rather, what to expect, okay? Busy slide, it just talks about you can have different kinds of encryption, and the graph on the right-hand side just talks about the encryption is not only who has access, but what they can do with it when they get it. So really important to define those two things. And one label can actually have different sets of permission groups within it. I just want to be clear on that. It's not a one-to-one thing. Okay, so a day 1, day 2, day 3 approach on this. Remember, pre-day, establish a good stakeholder group, define those key use case scenarios I talked about, understand your regulations and requirements. I worked with a large, like over 300,000 employee organization, and their rollout for sensitivity labels was they had a proof of concept in a non-production environment where they tested out the labeling experience, what the workflow was like, what the experience was like for their encrypted labels. Then they moved to, and there they heavily tested the classifier recommending a sensitivity label. Then they moved to pilot 1, which they called family and friends. Typically it's IT, might be some other partners across the organization that are okay to be involved in this, that are willing to provide feedback. You're going to get some classifier accuracy feedback on there as well. And then however many pilots you need after that, that's going to be a factor of the size of your organization, and eventually a firm-wide deployment. This organization did something similar to this, where they wanted in one screen to give to their executive team how they were going to roll this out over time. Okay, so this is just an example. This is not their details, but it's a very concise way of saying, you can see in the top, data identification, data classification, data protection. Make it specific to you. All of those decisions you made, all of the sensitive information types you're honing in on, that's super valuable for somebody kind of at that C-suite level to understand. What your taxonomy is, what's your default label, what labels are you recommending, what labels are you auto-applying, etc. And then kind of what you're doing at a high level for your day 1, day 2, day 3. Are you doing DLP right from day 1? Lots of organizations, in fact, start with DLP because it's a little bit easier than a full-blown sensitivity label project, or not. Are you starting with container sensitivity labels, or is that going to be a day 3 thing? You can do them in either order, but it's just good to document these things so you can see what your strategy and timeline is like. Make sense? Okay, data lifecycle and records management. What I'm meaning here, I'm back in Purview again. 2 areas. I'm mostly focused on the records management one. This is where retention labels are defined, maps to an organization's retention schedule. I've learned some hard things over the years when it comes to these projects, so I'm going to share them. SharePoint site and information architecture has a significant impact on your ability to automate these controls. And I would say if you have Wild West, you are going to struggle on the retention label side, more so than on the sensitivity label side. Having a provisioning solution will help automate some of these controls. And I would say in most cases, you simply can't do it without one. Unless you have a very simple environment with very simple retention needs, you need something in place. Bought or built needs to be there. IT and SharePoint teams need to be involved because there's some technical configurations that need to happen. OPATH, keyword query language, PowerShell, a good understanding of SharePoint search managed properties has to be there. If you want to use something called adaptive scopes, which is a good way of dynamically including and excluding locations, it has technical dependencies outside of Purview, Entra ID, SharePoint site properties. So how well governed is your Azure AD or Entra ID environment on this? If your organization's retention schedule has lots of custom disposition processes, Microsoft's answer to that is a Power Automate flow. You can build it, but it adds additional technical depth in your environments. On the non-tech side, I've worked with many customers where the IT team tries to treat the retention project like a data protection project. They're two completely different things. They have different audiences. One has a small number of labels. The other one has a very large number of labels, like in the hundreds in most cases. They're both implementing compliance controls, but completely different, and they do it in some similar ways, but many different ways as well. You absolutely need executive support for this project. It's going to take longer than you're probably comfortable with. Okay, so setting that accurate expectation up front for them, super important. Aim for progress, not perfection. Records managers like everything to be perfect lots of times. So it's unless you're going to automate absolutely everything, and you can't, you have to make end users your compliance allies, and there has to be a little bit of give and take in there. You need key roles and stakeholders involved from the start, else the project will struggle. This is what I mean by key stakeholders. Not only records managers, but your SharePoint team, your IT admins, and some other key stakeholders, legal, privacy, risk. Often they have an interest in your retention project. They all kind of bring different skills to the table. You can see underneath those round circles, I've tried to identify the skills they bring to the table. You will need any one of a number of them, depending on how complex your retention schedule is and how much you want to automate things, basically. There's two major factors that will contribute to the complexity and effort for any retention project. One is the retention schedule and how complex it is. I have seen some crazy retention schedules. That is going to be a major contributing factor to how complex this is going to be, as well as how well governed your SharePoint team's environment is. Those two are the ball game. If they're really complex, you are going to probably, you're not going to struggle, but it's going to be quite challenging. And I've tried to capture this in this graphic. So basic retention schedules on the left-hand side, all the way over to a very complex one on the right. Established good governance across SharePoint and Teams is on the bottom. Minimal governance is on the top. Depending on where those two are, you're going to have different experiences when you go to automate some of these things. I get asked this a lot. How long is a retention project going to take? And that's an impossible question to answer without understanding the retention schedule and the state of the SharePoint and Teams environment. If you're going to store business records in SharePoint and Teams, then you need to have a well-governed SharePoint and Teams environment, full stop. That's the way digital records are managed across the workplace today. Things that make a retention schedule complex are when it has ambiguous language in it. Things like when no longer useful. How do you automate that, right? That's kind of language from a paper-based time, but in the digital world, that's a very difficult thing to automate. Event-based retention, the sheer number of retention labels. I've seen retention schedules with over 1,000 retention labels. I mean, that's a big thing to manage. Okay, so that's something to ask about and look into in your own organization. So my approach on this, I have 5 steps. None of it is quick, but there's some very tactical steps I go through, and you will have something at the end of it that moves you along the road for records management. So each of these has some deliverables. Understanding how the tech works from both a records management perspective. So records managers need to go through some training too, as well as from an IT perspective, super important. And then look at the retention schedule holistically to try to get a feel for the capabilities that are going to be required for a proof of concept. Do you even need event-based retention? Do you need disposition review, etc.? And this is where you start to realize the impact of your current SharePoint and Teams architecture with the retention schedule, and if you're going to be running into some issues or not. Proof of concept, ideally in a non-production tenant, doesn't have to be, but I prefer it there. This is where you can start to think about some kind of a provisioning solution, or at least an approval process that sits in front of your new teams and sites. Look at some information architecture. Typically, what I see here is after the POC, there's a pause because records managers realize what's in front of them, and sometimes they reassess kind of their approach and how they're going to deal with this. So I see that lots. The deliverables out of this are some learnings. Impact assessments is a big one. How is this going to affect roles across our organization? How's it going to affect people that have to do the disposition review, etc. If you need to standardize some information architecture, what does that mean? What kind of impacts is that going to be? Only then do you start moving into preparing for production. So that is, getting into your provisioning solution a little bit more, applying your SharePoint information architecture to net new, retrofitting existing sites, something you have to think about. Dispositions. If the retention schedule requires a disposition process, is what happens at the end of the retention period. Some content can be automatically deleted, but much content can't. It has to go through some kind of a review process. And sometimes the way Microsoft has implemented it is not sufficient. There has to be some customization. So Microsoft's answer to that is build a custom Power Automate flow. So you need to build that for each retention label. Yeah, it has to be per each retention label. And they can be complex because sometimes requirements that records managers have are quite complex. Deliverables out of this are going to be your provisioning solution, of course, your Power Automate flows. I always like to start with the pilot group in production. Finance is a great, finance or legal affairs. Typically, it's one of those two. They deal, it's, usually a more confined group. They deal with content, that is fairly well defined, typically within the retention schedule. So that's usually what I see. Finance is great because they work in fiscal years and fiscal quarters, and it's quite easy to start working with them because they're very organized in how they work with their content. Pilots and production rollout. So I get asked for a recipe all the time, and the ability to build a recipe is a factor of how complicated your retention schedule is and how much you were able to kind of govern your environment and make some hard and fast decisions. So a recipe is good. It has to be a little bit flexible because it's not that hard and fast. But this is where those recipes are identified. And operationalization, which is a big one. This is updating your policies and your training material. Whatever your archive process is. So lots of companies have a requirement to archive some of their content to an external archive, or maybe they want to put it in an Azure storage location for long-term storage. So what do those requirements look like? That's long-term planning for your environment. There actually is something with Microsoft Syntax archiving coming out that does have some tiered or cold storage that they will provide that will still honor the retention configuration inside Microsoft Purview over in an Azure storage location. So that I think is still in preview, but that is coming. And I can see that being part of the plan, certainly when it comes to operationalizing some of these pieces. Okay, so my pragmatic approach, none of this is quick, if that's not obvious by now. Very few things in here are quick. The creation of the DLP policy, I suppose that was quick, but everything requires quite a bit of planning and before you do things. Just some good places to start on both the information protection side and the data lifecycle and records management side. If you're trying to kind of boil these down to some talking points when you're talking to the powers that be in your organization, this is, a place for you to start anyway. That's all I had. That was a ton of information. Any questions on this? I see a hand.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. So we got some questions.
Yeah.
Francis,
Yes.
you want to
Yes.
ask a question?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Joanne. As
Thank
usual,
you.
super interesting and very thorough. So my question is about the time required to master this huge machine, because in my point of view, I have already my hands full with SharePoint Teams. I'm consulting in that, and it seems to me that Purview is a whole different specialty. And it's kind of difficult for me to say, okay, I'll jump in there to add to that very broad competency that I already need to have with SharePoint and Teams and getting everybody to collaborate and things like that. So what's your view on should we all master this? It seems like a big chunk to bite.
It is. Yeah. It is a big chunk. I mean, I come from the SharePoint world. I was a former SharePoint administrator. Now that knowledge has definitely served me well inside Microsoft Purview. But that said, I pretty much abandoned my SharePoint admin days, and I'm focused in on these Microsoft Purview controls. Not only that, I'm focused in on specific Microsoft Purview controls, because Purview is much more than what you just saw here. So it's challenging for organizations where you are in IT and you're expected to wear all of these hats. 100%. That's probably where and why I get lots of consulting calls from IT people trying to understand this and what do we focus on and what are the best practices and the quick wins. I get why that's being asked, but I think organizations need to, I think they need to probably put more resources on these key areas. Like you need to have a team of people that understands some of these Purview pieces, and that's all they work in my opinion. And in your case, if you've already got SharePoint knowledge, you will find some of these things comfortable, like in records management, certainly. But it's too much to ask you to do all of these things. It's so complex. It really is. Yeah,
it looks that. And just a quick follow-up question is what size of corporation are interested in implementing this? I deal with small and medium businesses, and I absolutely don't see how someone could get into this. There's not a team of archivists and a team of SharePoint and a team. It's all like 2 or 3 IT guys that do everything. There's no way I can see that. So what's the size of the businesses that get into this kind of approach?
I mean, all sizes reach out to me, but how can I answer this? First of all, if you don't have E5 or some advanced compliance license feature, which some small and medium-sized businesses do, forget this, to be honest with you. Microsoft wouldn't like me saying that, but any of these automation capabilities, you need to have one of those licenses. And if you want to automate anything, and it's only the very small businesses that could maybe get away with, we're just going to manually label everything, right? So most of my customers are large enterprises. There's a team of records managers, there's a risk team, there's a legal team, there's, you know, archivists, everything like that. They're all in because it's, I hate to say it, but it's overwhelming for, you know, one records manager in an organization to try to get in front of this. It's a very big ask for them. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's a lot for them to take on. I don't know, Serge, do you have another viewpoint on that? I know you work with lots of companies. What is your take on that as well?
I totally agree with what you just said. Like, it's become it has become a monster. Like, knowing everything about everything in Microsoft 365, it's impossible now. So we need specialized people. And just as a consultant, like, if anyone here as a consultant is thinking of going to help a client to do like a DLP or security on their data, I would think about my insurance too, because like these people will have some legal aspects. And if you say you're a professional and you do a small mistake and there's some leak of information, like I wouldn't work in the US for sure, because I know you can get sued for anything. But like here, it would be the same thing too. So in order, before getting into a project, like there's some project I've refused because they were way too big for what I could do. I do management, I can help, but there are some projects that it's almost scary to get in because there's lots of implication, legal implication. There
are
responsibilities and stuff like that. So
there was a big case a while ago. A consultant company had misconfigured. This was a publicly, so I can say the name of the company, JP Morgan Chase. They had hired a consulting company for their retention. It was policies or something. It was misconfigured and millions of emails were deleted. That's what retention policies do that have a deletion component to them. So I don't know what the legal impacts were for that consulting company, but yeah, mistakes like that happen. And this is why I always write into my contract, I'm a hands off the keyboard person for that very reason. I give guidance, but it's ultimately up to the customer to decide, make that decision on what they want to do. I'm just going to tell them all of the options available to them. So yeah, that's why I do that. But for getting back to your question about small companies, it's a challenge for them for sure. The only way they can kind of work through this, in my estimation, is try to keep their retention schedule as simple as possible, and manage it that way. But that's kind of all I have for that.
There's maybe a use case that I've seen, because I worked with a small business that has some salaries, pay data for the high management, and they wanted to keep it as secure as possible. And they have passwords on their Excel files, and they were overwhelmed by the number of passwords. And I thought, maybe this could be a quick win, easy to configure, just to have a protection label applied to it. So is this maybe like a very small use case? We can bite a small chunk of that could be, Okay.
I actually find sensitivity labels in that respect are easier to implement than the big retention label schedule. So yes, that's totally doable.
Thank you.
If I can just add something about
what
you were saying, Serge. We are at this point where we got pretty much the same problem, the same concern, with many different things, many different things, like automation, for example. We got pretty much the same kind of trouble where we are trying to, because the customers are paying a lot of money for
Mhm.
licenses. So they want to jump into huge projects instead of starting by small project first. And especially when it comes to talk about responsibility, it's always better to start with small things. Like in automation, we got the same problem. When people are thinking about starting with Power Automate, because I can talk about Power Automate more easily, they are all thinking about, oh, we will automate huge processes from start, and they will realize in a couple of minutes that it's going to be huge, and it's going to be super complex from the very first steps. So think about small things, like you were saying, Francis. Start from small projects. Test the technology, like you said, Joanne. You have to know about the technology because thinking about something bigger. So definitively, before thinking about responsibility, I think.
Baby steps. Start.
Yeah. Very much so. Yeah.
Very good.
Cool.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I have one, if nobody has any.
Okay.
I did not touch Syntax Archive yet, but
Okay.
like if you got like retention policies and you want to take your documents after a certain time to archive them through Syntax Archive, the retention policies have not been edited yet to be able to move the content to cold storage or cheaper storage, right? Or I missed it?
The way I understand it is the archive will, and I have not tried this in full transparency, but one of the main selling points of Syntax Archive is it will still honor whatever retention policy setting you had when you will be allowed to move it to an archive location. I don't know what the mechanism of that is going to be. Maybe it's going to be a setting on the policy. I don't know, but it will work with the Purview retention labels and policies, which is awesome.
That's what I've heard, but like I didn't see anything of it yet, so I was just wondering.
I haven't either. I have not seen yet either. Yeah.
So Phil was just asking two questions. I will just start with the last one. Do you know a database with dot types and conversation periods? Do you already got a kind of standard database with all these different things? When you are applying this kind of project to a new customer, do you have I don't know, a base or something?
A base of
kind of document we will find. I mean, you know, all these different even if all the companies got differences about retention and all the stuff, they all got at least the same trouble, the same problem with basics documents like sales, like contract, like you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean, but I think the answer to that, for part of the answer to that anyway, would be that data classification I was showing you with all of the sensitive information types and the trainable classifiers. So that same set is published to every single tenant, so everybody can see where those matches are. It's up to you to use them or not. You can completely ignore them, but that's kind of gets you partway down the road of understanding, oh, we've got credit card numbers in our environment, or we have financial budget documents in our environment. But Microsoft probably will never propose. Actually, I think Microsoft used to, I don't know if they do anymore. They used to publish a sensitivity label taxonomy in a new tenant if you wanted to. You could just pick their taxonomy. I guess you could do that, but I would rather go through the exercise of defining what you want your taxonomy to be and the settings for you rather than picking some generic sensitivity label taxonomy, because it doesn't take that long to do that. On the retention label side, that's too industry and organization specific. Depending on the industry you're in, sometimes the retention schedule is often prescribed to you, sometimes more than one, on this is what you must have. I know this is Montreal, but in the States, the National Archives in the States, of course, every state has to comply with their retention schedule. So what they have done is they've created a CSV file in the Microsoft file plan format of their entire retention schedule that you can import into and adjust as needed. So they're trying, I don't know if the person who asked this is trying to figure out kind of a template to go off of, but organizations are trying to do that, but it's really the regulator that needs to do it on the retention label side.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you. Thank you. I think it answered the question.
Okay.
We had another question about the licensing, but maybe we will discuss about, I don't know if you want to discuss about the licensing thing.
Well, it wouldn't be right if I didn't get a licensing question, so bring it. Sure.
So how to sell the idea to my boss? Pricing is $12 per user per month. If I start with the finance and IT teams, maybe 10 users, what happens to users who don't have Purview licenses? Can I work with 2 licenses by departments?
It completely depends on the features that you want to use. Okay, so if you want to recommend a sensitivity label or auto apply one or automatically apply a retention label or even default a retention label, if an end user is working in a document, so they're creating it, they need the advanced license. So you don't have to get the full blown E5 or A5. You can get the individual slightly cheaper add-on SKUs if you want for some of these capabilities. But yeah, it's very difficult to get away with just a minimal number of users needing this. So it's not that just the records managers need it. Everybody that has contribute access to that library where this automation is running needs that advanced license. So in that way, it can get very expensive for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone got another question. Thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank you for having me, everybody. That was really great.
Next time it has to be in person. So February.
I hope so.
February. Okay. It's cold there in February, right? Maybe,
but it's
maybe
cold
warmer
everywhere.
than here because I live in Saskatchewan.
It's cold out your way too. So.
Yeah.
It is.
You know how to
Okay.
dress.
I do. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Alors, est-ce qu'il y a des questions en français, des commentaires
Il nous reste
de la session?
15 minutes si vous avez des questions. Ouais.
Est-ce que ça vous a aidé à mieux comprendre un peu, à mieux comprendre ce qui se passe, ce qui est faisable en fait au niveau de la protection des données? On en avait déjà parlé en français, certaines des choses. Joanne est allée avec plus de détails sur des expériences en fait qu'elle a eues, sur des processus aussi pour vous aider. Donc, si vous voulez faire des planifications, ben, comme on l'a dit, là, c'est pas, il n'y a pas une recette magique qui s'applique chez tous les clients. Il y a des choses à penser, des choses à faire, commencer par des petits pas, pas essayer de tout faire d'un seul coup, trouver des personnes qui ont travaillé avec aussi, ça va être important. Ça s'apprend. Okay? Toutes les personnes qui travaillent avec ces outils-là, ils l'ont appris à quelque part, mais si vous faites et l'apprentissage et la mise en place, ça risque d'être long d'atteindre le but puis je ne suis pas convaincu qu'on va réussir à atteindre le but du premier coup si on n'a pas eu une expérience avant. Donc, il va falloir être patient aussi pour pouvoir mettre en place ces choses-là. Puis, il y a énormément de choses à voir aussi. Là. Fait que,
pour tous ces outils-là, en complément de ce que vient de dire Serge, moi, je pense que je reste convaincu qu'à chaque fois, les problèmes, ce n'est pas trop dans la technologie parce que on le voit bien, la technologie permet de faire beaucoup de choses. Et vous, probablement la plupart d'entre vous, vous abordez la technologie, enfin cet outil-là d'un point de vue technologique. Le problème, c'est que malheureusement, quand on commence à parler de légal, quand on commence à parler de rétention, toutes ces affaires-là, on n'est plus dans la technologie, on est dans l'organisation et dans la prévision, quoi. Donc, c'est plus un problème, je vois ça plus comme un problème de gouvernance, de savoir jusqu'où vous devez aller et à quel moment vous devez lâcher l'affaire par rapport à ce que vous mettez en place. Ne vous engagez pas dans des projets, tu le disais très bien tout à l'heure, Serge, ne vous engagez pas dans des projets qui engagent de votre responsabilité, par exemple, par rapport à des aspects légaux. Gardez-vous une gêne par rapport à ça. Faites attention à ça, quoi. Typiquement, c'est tellement facile de voir uniquement l'aspect technologique de la chose et d'oublier qu'en arrière, il y a des choses bien plus importantes. Donc, pensez à établir vraiment une gouvernance claire par rapport à ça. C'est qui fait quoi et à quel moment.
Rôle et responsabilité, point numéro 1, presque.
Ça commence par là, à mon avis.
Hyper important. Puis aussi, même quand on définit les rôles et responsabilités, il va y avoir des côtés techniques définitivement. Mais est-ce qu'on veut donner le contrôle de Purview à quelqu'un qui ne connaît pas tous les outils? Comment on va donner contrôle à qui? On va donner le contrôle de ces outils-là. Il y a plein de paramétrisation, de configuration. Puis je l'ai vu dans les projets, là. Le service informatique a dit non, même si c'est toi l'archiviste, c'est toi qui définis les règles, c'est pas toi qui vas configurer les règles. Parce que nous, on a l'expérience, on a l'expertise, on a planifié l'information. Donc, ça va prendre une bonne discussion puis mettre en place le processus de la définition des règles. Il y a des personnes qui n'ont pas les connaissances techniques pour configurer l'environnement Microsoft 365, mais sans ces personnes-là, on n'est pas capable de configurer le Purview parce qu'on a besoin de leurs connaissances pour pouvoir définir les règles, les stratégies et toutes ces choses-là. Donc, c'est un travail d'équipe qui va devoir être fait. Puis, comme Nicolas a dit, rôle et responsabilité, c'est la clé si on veut bien partir. Là.
Je vois une deuxième chose, c'est que, je rejoins la question de, alors c'est un utilisateur anonyme là, qui a posé la question, comment est-ce qu'on supprime un enregistrement, un retention label, comment est-ce qu'on le supprime? Aujourd'hui, il y a le retention label, tu ne peux pas le supprimer. Une fois qu'il est créé, il est créé. Donc, parce que légalement, malheureusement, on ne peut pas supprimer un retention label. Donc, pour répondre à ta question, je sais qui que tu sois, un retention label, tu ne peux pas le supprimer, même si tu as fait une erreur dedans, même si tu as fait… Donc, on en revient à la question essentielle avant d'appliquer ce genre de système aussi, c'est, Joanne en a parlé tout à l'heure sans rentrer dans le détail, vous devez avoir une stratégie par rapport à la mise en place de vos changements dans vos environnements. Et dans nos environnements, on travaille tout de suite en production. C'est-à-dire que vous n'avez pas d'environnement de pré-production. Donc, mettez en place, avec le système de scripting, il y a pas mal de solutions qui existent pour ça. Mais avant tout, posez-vous la question de savoir comment est-ce que vous appliquez les changements. C'est quoi votre stratégie de production, pré-production sur votre environnement Office 365, où tout est en production, par défaut.
C'est le problème que je dirais avec la partie POC qui était énoncée là, et c'est pas, et les gens ils percutent pas de suite, c'est que comme tu le disais, un label de rétention n'est pas supprimable. Donc un environnement de POC nécessite un autre environnement Microsoft 365. Donc nécessite de mettre des données de production.
Absolument.
Soi-disant production, qui reflète la production.
Des tests qui reflètent la production.
C'est sur un environnement tel. Et ça demande beaucoup de jobs. Parce qu'en fait, il faut quand même faire un environnement où tu as des gens qui vont travailler un peu tous les jours, qui vont faire les trucs, qui vont devoir faire sur 2 environnements.
Mais c'est ce que vous faites dans le développement, ça.
Oui,
quand vous faites du développement,
sur le développement, déjà, tu as les devs et tu as quelques gens qui vont faire la queue. En plus, tu peux automatiser les 3/4. Mais
quand vous faites du développement, il y a un jeu de développement.
Oui, sauf que nous, un user qui se connecte, qui va checker, qui va appliquer le label, qui va faire des envois de courriel ou checker des choses dans ce goût-là. La plupart des devs, tu peux les automatiser aujourd'hui. Là, il n'y a quasiment plus de besoin d'humain pour faire des tests. C'est ça qui fait la grosse différence aujourd'hui. Mais dans ce type de cas, parce que je le rencontre encore chez 2-3 clients, c'est terriblement compliqué de demander un jeu de test qui reflète la réalité sans qu'il y ait des données réellement confidentielles dedans et de mettre des gens en leur disant, en plus de votre job actuel, là, faites un peu de job là à côté pour qu'on puisse faire vivre l'environnement et voir ce qui reflète la réalité. Et là, c'est super compliqué. Il faut trouver les gens volontaires, il faut trouver les gens qui ont le temps, il faut trouver les gens qui le font correctement, il faut avoir les feedbacks de comment ça marche, pourquoi ça ne marche pas. C'est
un job phénoménal, quoi.
Ouais. C'est une horreur.
Exact.
Je vous écoute, puis je suis en train de regarder pour planifier dans les prochaines semaines, mois, mettre ça en place. Et vous me faites réaliser que je pense que je vais faire un step back. J'ai des collègues qui sont en ligne qui vont se reconnaître, mais je pense que il y a comme une étape d'organisation qu'il faut qu'il y ait un niveau de maturité de l'organisation pour que le résultat que ça donne pour faire tout ce déploiement-là soit arrivé à ça. Il faut que si la compagnie n'est pas à ce niveau-là, le résultat risque de ne pas arriver à un niveau intéressant comme final. Est-ce que mon interprétation est mauvaise?
Ça va dépendre plutôt de l'organisation. En fait, il y a la maturité et aussi les gens qui travaillent dedans. J'ai l'exemple d'une société, je ne vais pas la nommer parce que je n'ai pas le droit là, mais grosso modo, ils ont 2-3 personnes qui font partie d'une équipe d'archivistes et qui gèrent en fait tous les documents de l'organisation. Donc, ils savent exactement au document près la confidentialité, la rétention. Donc là, dans ce cadre-là, c'était assez facile de mettre de la rétention et de la sensibilité parce que l'organisation est gouvernée déjà par des gens qui gèrent des documents. Par contre, si c'est une entreprise qui n'a pas d'archivistes ou en tout cas de gens qui ont imposé des gouvernances au niveau des documents, c'est là que ça devient compliqué parce qu'en fait, il faut la faire la première fois comme si on prenait la job en fait, des archivistes à ce moment-là. Et là, ça devient compliqué parce qu'il faut identifier tous les types de documents, toutes les possibilités. Et en fait, en plus de ça, si la population, on va dire, de l'organisation n'a pas l'habitude d'avoir ce type de contraintes, faut aussi ajouter à ça la partie adoption, dont on n'a pas vraiment parlé jusqu'à maintenant. On a surtout parlé de l'aspect technique de créer des étiquettes de rétention et de sensibilité, mais il faut aussi informer les utilisateurs à la fin. Certains vont être automatiques, on en a entendu parler, à condition d'avoir des licences nécessaires, donc A5, E5 à minima. Donc, si vous avez que des E3, c'est manuel, donc à bras. Donc, il faut aller expliquer à vos utilisateurs, il n'y a pas de métadonnées là. C'est une étiquette qui se comporte comme une sorte de métadonnées d'un point de vue visuel. Il faut leur expliquer qu'il faut des fois les apposer manuellement et à quoi ça correspond et qu'est-ce que ça a comme impact. Et ça ajoute un degré de difficulté. Donc, ça va vraiment dépendre de la maturité de l'organisation et qui contrôle vraiment la gouvernance des documents. Comme je disais tantôt, s'il y a une équipe qui s'en occupe déjà, ça pourrait très bien se passer. Mais si ce n'est pas le cas, ça demande la job.
Oui, puis une des choses, si tu as remarqué, dans une des diapositives à Joanne, là, elle a parlé de l'architecture d'information, puis elle a dit que si tu n'as pas de contrôle puis de processus de création de site, puis c'est le Far West chez vous, ben oublie ça, il va falloir qu'il y ait un ménage qui soit fait si tu veux réussir à le faire correctement. Puis malheureusement, ben beaucoup d'environnements Microsoft 365 qui ont été mis en place au début de la COVID que je le vois, puis c'était le Far West au début parce que n'importe qui pouvait faire n'importe quoi, n'importe où, n'importe comment. Mais ensuite, comment tu structures ça? Fait qu'il y a beaucoup d'entreprises qui n'ont pas pensé à l'architecture d'information. Elle n'a pas été planifiée. Donc, pour aller automatiser des choses, aller faire la découverte, aller centraliser l'information, ça devient très compliqué aussi. Puis en plus, même si on a une équipe d'archivistes, j'en ai vu là, des places là, où il y a des centres, des archivistes avec des archives papier, mais le plan de classification, là, il est ça d'épais avec plein de règles. Comment tu vas mettre ça en place si tu n'as jamais fait ça? C'est pas aussi simple.
C'est surtout pas à toi de statuer.
Et en plus, c'est ça. Puis c'est pas à l'équipe informatique de dire non, on le fait pas comme ça. Il y a des besoins aussi. Fait qu'il va falloir s'entendre, puis ça va prendre quelqu'un avec un chandail zébré, noir et blanc, qui va faire l'arbitre aussi, puis aller s'assurer que tout le monde réussisse à se parler, puis à s'entendre aussi. Fait que ça, c'est des choses qui sont hyper importantes. Juste identifier les données, c'était la première phase là, que Joanne a montrée. Puis c'est vraiment ça. Comment on fait pour identifier nos données? Il faut savoir c'est quelles données on veut identifier, comment les identifier. Si on n'a pas ça en partant, ben, on est peut-être mieux de reculer un peu puis de regarder, je pense. Là. Mais, je pense que c'est l'avis que Joanne a donné aussi. Fait que je pense que tu as bien compris.
Oui, j'ai bien compris. C'est bon.
Puis pour vrai, là, si on a un projet de consultation qui fait ça, je pense qu'il faudrait qu'on engage en sous-traitance Joanne pour partir. S'il y en a qui se sont ramassés avec des projets de même, là, je ne partirais pas tout seul de même. Là, genre, même avec la belle heure de Joanne, c'est que la pointe de l'iceberg, c'est tout un monde. Là.
Effectivement.
Un consultant qui a eu l'occasion de travailler avec plusieurs clients, avec même si c'est pas allé jusqu'à la prod, hein, mais d'avoir plusieurs preuves de concept pour avoir déjà des éléments, on va dire, d'expérience et de comparaison. C'est déjà un bon début. Moi, je pense qu'il faut y aller là. Faut quand même, quand on a des clients ou quand même l'entreprise pour laquelle vous travaillez veut se lancer un peu, comme je disais tantôt, si vous arrivez à galvaniser quelques personnes pour avoir un environnement, on va dire, de test, c'est super intéressant de le faire au moins une fois pour avoir ce feedback et savoir si oui, maintenant, c'est le moment d'y aller. Pas encore, mais il faut le faire, je pense. Faut pas se fier forcément à quelqu'un qui a déjà toute son expérience. Il faut se faire sa propre expérience. Aujourd'hui, je pense que c'est le moment plus que jamais. Parce qu'avec toute l'automatisation, l'IA qui s'en vient encore de plus en plus, c'est ça, c'est excellent. Je touche un sujet, mais en fait, je reprends juste par exemple le petit exemple tout bête et je m'arrêterai avec ça, c'est ChatGPT. Qu'est-ce qui se passe quand j'envoie de la data sur ChatGPT et que c'est un ChatGPT qui est public et que j'envoie un document qui lui est censé être privé et que celui-ci n'est pas confidentialisé.
Oui, mais là tu sors.
En fait, ça pour dire c'est la protection des données, mais en fait, des sujets qui vont devenir de plus en plus sensibles à cause de ça, je pense. Et que c'est le moment maintenant de commencer à prendre le train parce que dans pas longtemps, on va se faire vite dépasser, je pense.
Ouais, on va bientôt terminer parce que malheureusement, nous, on va être un peu pris par le temps et on va devoir quitter la salle. Je voulais juste te dire, premièrement, le but, c'était pas de vous faire peur. Donc, le but ce soir, c'était pas non plus de vous effrayer. Mais je veux juste réagir sur Marie-Claude, ta remarque par rapport à peut-être retarder un peu la décision. En fait, est-ce que ce n'est pas une question d'échelle, en fait? Peut-être l'échelle qui n'est peut-être pas juste bien choisie dans ton projet. Peut-être que c'est une échelle que tu peux réduire, par exemple, sur un projet comme celui-là. On a vu tout à l'heure que ce n'était pas forcément l'ampleur qui est importante, c'est vraiment de bien définir le périmètre de ton projet, en fait. Puis peut-être le réduire, parce que c'est peut-être ça qui va permettre, comme le dit Laurent, de démarrer, et puis avec des choses qui sont peut-être plus simples.
Ouais, puis en plus de réduire, peut-être allonger la période. Fait que si on dit on veut mettre ça en place pour janvier, ben non, là, on va. D'ici janvier, on va avoir travaillé dans un environnement de laboratoire, on va avoir fait des tests, on va avoir préparé. Puis en janvier, on va préparer un environnement de tests pilote pour tester des choses, puis on va étirer le projet dans le temps. Je pense que c'est important, surtout si on n'a pas l'expérience. Puis pour répondre à Francis aussi, ben heureusement, il y a de plus en plus de projets de gestion documentaire, puis il y en a pas des Joanne. Des Joanne, il n'y en a pas beaucoup parce qu'elle connaît à fond, mais il y en a quand même plusieurs qui connaissent. Là, il y a de plus en plus de consultants qui connaissent bien l'environnement. Mais il faut bien les cibler, en fait, puis poser les bonnes questions quand on va venir le temps de les engager. Mais il y en existe.
Ce qu'on veut déjà.
Il y en existe, ouais.
Sylvain, est-ce que tu penses qu'en quelques minutes, tu peux…
Oui, mais très rapidement, dans le fond, mais je pense que c'est toujours la théorie des petits pas, comme on parlait tantôt. Serge, tu le parlais aussi, juste de cibler les documents qui sont très sensibles. Même Francis, quand tu parlais de use case, mais c'est où qu'il y a de la valeur de mettre en place tout ça, c'est de cibler vraiment ces documents-là sont très, très sensibles. On va leur donner plus d'amour, mais le reste, on peut quand même sécuriser de façon très convenable avec toute la sécurité SharePoint, avec tous les mécanismes, le DLP, tout ça. Fait que, tu sais, je pense que c'est juste de penser à la portée puis d'y aller en petits lots. Puis là, si on fait une erreur ou si on a un ajustement, c'est plus facile à réparer. Puis tranquillement, pas vite, aller élargir si on veut aller plus loin. Mais c'est ça, c'est une grosse machine, mais en même temps, il faut l'apprivoiser, cette machine-là. Puis la présentation de ce soir, là, c'était du bonbon. Comme d'habitude, c'était super bien.
Excellent. Ben, désolé tout le monde, on doit absolument quitter parce que les lumières vont se fermer.
Merci beaucoup pour toutes vos bonnes participations. C'est vraiment, ça fait plaisir à entendre.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup,
gang.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Merci. Bye-bye.